You've probably had a drink at some point in your life. A beer, a glass of wine, something at a party you don't fully remember the next morning. Here's something you've never had to think about. Nobody invented that, not really. Not the way you'd invent a wheel or a tool or a house. It happened by accident. Millions of years before humans existed at all, and by the time our ancestors actually discovered it, they weren't the first ones drinking. They were just the latest. Fruit falls. Fruit rots. Wild yeast, floating invisibly in the air, lands on that fruit and starts breaking down its sugar into alcohol. The exact same biological process happening in a modern brewery, just running wild in the dirt with nobody controlling it at all. This has been happening for tens of millions of years, long before anything resembling a human ever walked anywhere on Earth, which means somewhere, at some point, an early human, or something not quite human yet, ate fermented fruit off the ground. Not on purpose, not knowing what alcohol even was, and felt something. That single, accidental moment is where this entire story actually begins. Not with someone brewing anything, with someone eating garbage and discovering, completely by accident, that it made them feel different. Let's start with the biology, because it explains something genuinely strange about why humans respond to alcohol the way we do it all. Researchers studying primate evolution have proposed something called the Drunken Monkey Hypothesis, put forward by biologist Robert Dudley, which argues that our attraction to the smell and taste of alcohol isn't some modern cultural accident. It's ancient, wired deep into primate biology. Because for millions of years, the smell of fermentation was a genuinely useful survival signal. Ripe, sugar-rich fruit is valuable, calorie-dense food. Overripe, slightly fermenting fruit is often even easier to digest and detect from farther away because the smell of fermentation carries much further than the smell of plain ripe fruit. An animal that could smell fermentation from a distance had an advantage finding food before competitors did. This means the ability to detect and actually enjoy the smell of alcohol may have been directly favored by evolution, long before alcohol had anything to do with parties, rituals, or relaxation. It was a food-finding tool first. Genetic research examining the enzyme responsible for metabolizing alcohol in humans and other primates supports this timeline surprisingly precisely. A specific mutation in an alcohol metabolizing enzyme found in humans and our closest great ape relatives, but not in more distantly related primates, appears to have emerged around 10 million years ago, dramatically increasing the ability to break down alcohol efficiently. Researchers studying this mutation have connected its emergence to a period when our ancestors were shifting from a primarily tree-dwelling lifestyle to spending more time foraging on the ground, exactly where fallen, fermenting fruit would have been most available. In other words, natural selection appears to have specifically equipped our evolutionary line with a better ability to process alcohol at almost precisely the moment our ancestors would have started encountering it regularly on the forest floor. So this wasn't a distant coincidence. The biological hardware for dealing with alcohol was already deeply embedded in us long before modern humans existed at all, refined over millions of years of primate evolution entirely because of naturally fermenting fruit. Now picture the actual moment this evidence points toward, tens of thousands of years later. Once anatomically modern humans existed. Someone forages through undergrowth and finds fruit that's fallen and sat for days. Skin split, smelling sharp and strange, sweeter and stronger than fresh fruit. Exactly the kind of smell that evolution had already primed them to find appealing rather than repulsive. They eat it, likely out of simple hunger or opportunism rather than any understanding of what was actually happening inside that fruit. And within a short time, they'd have felt something entirely new. A shift in mood, reduced inhibition, possibly lightheadedness, warmth, an unfamiliar loosening of normal caution and tension. There's no reason to think that first experience was deliberate, controlled, or even particularly pleasant every single time. Some fermented fruit found in the wild would have been mild. Some would have been much stronger, or contaminated with harmful bacteria alongside the alcohol, making the experience genuinely unpleasant or even dangerous. But often enough, frequently enough across a species eating opportunistically across enormous stretches of time, the experience would have registered as notably different, memorable, and, for at least some portion of the group, worth encountering again. Here's where accident starts becoming intention, because noticing something once is very different from deliberately recreating it. And the physical evidence for that shift from accident to intention is more specific and more remarkable than most people realize. At a site called Jiahu in China's Henan province, archaeologists excavating a Neolithic settlement dated to around 7000 BCE uncovered pottery jars, and residue analysis conducted on those jars revealed something extraordinary. Chemical traces embedded in the pottery walls, absorbed over repeated use, showed a consistent signature matching a fermented beverage made from a mixture of rice, honey, and fruit, likely hawthorn fruit or wild grape based on the specific chemical markers identified. This wasn't a single lucky jar. Researchers found this same chemical signature repeated across multiple vessels at the site, suggesting a genuinely established, repeated practice rather than a one-time experiment. The people at Jiahu weren't simply eating fermented fruit they happened to find. They were combining specific ingredients in specific containers repeatedly over what the archaeological layering suggests was a sustained period of time. That's deliberate production. That's someone understanding, at least functionally, that combining these particular ingredients in this particular way reliably produced something worth drinking again and again. What makes Jiahu even more remarkable is what else was found at the same site. This wasn't an isolated brewing operation disconnected from the rest of the culture. Jiahu is also home to some of the earliest known playable musical instruments in human history, bone flutes strikingly similar in concept to the ones found in Europe, and early evidence of symbol use that some researchers have connected to the roots of later Chinese writing systems. In other words, the same community capable of producing intentional fermented beverages was also a community already engaged in music, symbolic communication, and complex cultural practice. Fermentation wasn't happening in a vacuum, off to the side. It was happening inside a genuinely sophisticated, multifaceted culture, developing several of these threads simultaneously. A separate, similarly striking body of evidence comes from the Zagros Mountains region of the Middle East, spanning parts of modern-day Iran. At a site called Haji Firuz Tepe, pottery jars dated to roughly 5,400 BCE were found with residue containing tartaric acid, a compound strongly and specifically associated with grapes, alongside terebinth tree resin, likely added deliberately as a preservative or flavoring agent, since terebinth resin has documented antimicrobial properties that would have helped keep the beverage from spoiling as quickly. This combination, specifically, is considered some of the strongest existing chemical evidence for early intentional wine production anywhere in the archaeological record. Again, this isn't consistent with someone accidentally consuming fermented grapes found on the ground. Deliberately combining grape residue with a specific resin known for preservative properties requires exactly the kind of applied accumulated knowledge that takes real time, real experimentation, and real transmission between people to develop and refine. Together, Jiahu and the Zagros finds tell a consistent story from two completely unconnected regions of the ancient world, separated by thousands of miles and roughly 1,500 years. Humans in wildly different environments working with completely different ingredients, rice and hawthorn fruit in one case, grapes and tree resin in the other, arrived at the same fundamental innovation independently. Deliberate, repeated, refined fermentation, moving well beyond anything that could be explained by pure accident alone. By the time we reach ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt, both textual and archaeological evidence shows beer wasn't just present but genuinely central to daily life. Consumed by essentially everyone in a given community, workers included, sometimes even distributed specifically as part of wages or rations for laborers, a detail that tells you something important about how deeply embedded fermented beverages had already become in organized society by that point. This raises an obvious question. Why did fermentation spread and get deliberately refined so quickly across so many completely unrelated regions and cultures once humans figured out how to control it? Part of the answer is straightforwardly practical, and it's easy to overlook from a modern perspective where clean water is something you generally take for granted. In many ancient settlements, water sources were frequently contaminated with harmful bacteria and pathogens, especially once humans began living in denser, more permanent communities where waste disposal and water sources weren't always cleanly separated. Fermentation, it turns out, has a genuinely useful practical side effect entirely separate from its mood-altering properties. The fermentation process itself tends to kill many harmful pathogens, and the resulting alcohol content acts as a natural preservative, meaning fermented beverages were frequently, measurably safer to drink than untreated water in many ancient urban environments. Some researchers studying the history of ancient beer specifically have argued that this practical safety benefit may have been just as significant a driver of beer's widespread adoption in early cities as any of its other effects, especially in densely populated settlements where water contamination posed a real, constant, and often invisible danger. There's also a genuine nutritional dimension worth taking seriously. Fermentation increases the bioavailability of certain nutrients in grains and fruits, breaking down compounds that would otherwise make some nutrients harder for the human body to absorb, and early fermented beverages, particularly beer made from grain, would have functioned as a meaningfully calorie-dense, nutrient-carrying part of the diet in societies that were increasingly dependent on grain agriculture, not merely an intoxicant consumed for its effects alone. But it would be a mistake to reduce this story to pure practicality, because the social and ritual dimension of fermented beverages runs just as deep and shows up just as early and just as consistently across cultures that had no contact with each other whatsoever, in forms specific enough to each region that they're worth walking through individually. In ancient Egypt, beer was closely associated with specific deities and used directly in religious offerings and ceremonies. In ancient Sumer, a hymn dedicated to Ninkasi, the goddess specifically associated with beer, effectively survives today as one of the oldest known beer recipes in written history, describing the actual brewing process in enough functional detail that modern brewers have successfully recreated beer from it. In Mesoamerica, a fermented beverage called Pulque, made from the sap of the maguey plant, held a role that went far beyond casual consumption. Aztec religious and cultural tradition treated pulque as sacred, connected directly to specific deities associated with the drink, and its consumption was tightly, formally regulated rather than freely available to everyone at all times. Historical accounts describe strict social rules around who was permitted to drink pulque and under what specific circumstances, with excessive or inappropriate consumption carrying real social and sometimes legal consequences. This wasn't casual. It was a substance considered powerful enough, both spiritually and socially, to require deliberate cultural containment, structured directly into law and religious practice rather than left to individual discretion. Across multiple regions of Africa, palm wine, produced through the natural fermentation of sap, tapped directly from various species of palm tree, developed as an independent fermented tradition entirely separate from the grain and fruit-based traditions found elsewhere. Historical and ethnographic records describe palm wine playing a central, formalized role in community gatherings, marriage negotiations, and specific ceremonial rites across numerous distinct cultures throughout the continent, often prepared and shared communally as a direct part of the social bonding function itself, rather than consumed privately or individually. In numerous other societies across completely different continents and time periods, from ancient China to various regions of Southeast Asia, alcohol consumption appears consistently and independently tied to communal feasting, coming-of-age rituals, funeral rites, and formal social bonding events, each region developing its own specific ingredients, its own specific preparation methods, and its own specific cultural rules, while arriving at strikingly similar conclusions about the substance's power and the need to formally structure its use. This pattern connects directly to something you've likely already picked up on if you've watched other videos exploring how ancient humans functioned socially. Shared, structured group activities, singing together, eating together, ritual together, appear again and again throughout human history, specifically because they build trust and social cohesion in ways that matter enormously for group survival. Alcohol appears to have functioned as one particularly effective, chemically assisted version of exactly that same social bonding mechanism. Reduced social inhibition in a controlled, shared setting can measurably lower the normal social barriers people maintain around each other, making genuine bonding, vulnerability, and trust building meaningfully easier and faster to achieve within a group. Anthropologists studying the social function of alcohol across multiple traditional societies have specifically noted its recurring role in negotiation, conflict resolution, and alliance building between different groups, functioning almost as a kind of social lubricant with real, measurable practical consequences for group cohesion and cooperation, not merely a pleasant diversion. Here's where the story becomes genuinely more complicated, though, because it would be dishonest to present this purely as an unambiguous positive development in human history without acknowledging its real, well-documented costs, both then and now. The same properties that made alcohol socially and practically useful, reduced inhibition, altered judgment, physiological dependence with regular heavy use, also made it capable of causing genuine harm. Historical and modern research alike consistently show that regular heavy alcohol consumption carries serious health risks, and that alcohol dependency has been a documented, persistent problem across human societies for as long as historical records exist to actually track it. Ancient texts from multiple civilizations, including some of the same societies that celebrated and ritualized alcohol consumption most prominently, also contain explicit warnings against excessive drinking, suggesting the tension between alcohol's genuine social benefits and its genuine risks isn't a modern realization at all. It was recognized, documented, and actively grappled with by the very earliest societies that had access to it in meaningful quantity. The Aztec regulation of pulque, described earlier, is itself direct evidence of exactly this tension being consciously managed rather than ignored. This dual nature, useful and risky at the same time, genuinely beneficial in moderation and genuinely harmful in excess, may actually help explain why so many different, completely unconnected human cultures independently developed elaborate rules, rituals, and social structures specifically around alcohol consumption rather than either banning it outright or allowing entirely unrestricted access. Structured drinking occasions, formal toasts, specific ceremonial contexts, culturally reinforced expectations about appropriate versus inappropriate drinking behavior, these represent a remarkably consistent pattern of humans collectively trying to capture the real social benefits of alcohol while simultaneously managing and containing its genuine, well-understood risks, refined and re-refined across thousands of years of trial, error, and accumulated cultural knowledge in a strikingly similar way to how ancient humans handled dangerous but useful plants. A knowledge system built the exact same way, through direct cost, careful observation, and structured transmission across generations, just applied here to a substance rather than to identifying safe food. So if you trace the entire chain all the way back, from a modern beer or glass of wine, back through carefully guarded traditional brewing recipes passed down for generations, back through the formalized religious and ceremonial role alcohol played in some of history's earliest organized civilizations. From Sumerian temple hymns to sacred Aztec pulque law to communal African palm wine tradition, back through the first deliberate, intentional fermentation experiments at sites like Jiahu and the Zagros Mountains nearly 7,000 to 9,000 years ago, all the way back to some early human or pre-human ancestor eating fermented fruit off a forest floor by pure accident, driven by hunger and a smell that millions of years of evolution had already trained them to find appealing rather than repulsive. You land on something worth genuinely sitting with. This wasn't invented the way a wheel or a written language was invented, through deliberate design solving a clearly identified problem. It was discovered by accident, refined slowly and repeatedly by trial and error over an almost incomprehensibly long span of time, and then deliberately, carefully built into some of the most central social, religious, and practical structures of nearly every early human civilization that has ever been studied. You didn't inherit a taste for alcohol because someone clever figured out how to brew it once, and everyone simply copied the idea from there. You inherited it because, in a very real, literal, biological sense, your ancestors' ancestors, going back tens of millions of years before anything resembling a human walked anywhere on this planet, were quietly, gradually shaped by the smell of fruit rotting on a forest floor, long before there was ever a single mind around capable of understanding or even wondering exactly why that smell felt so worth following.